My name is John Avila. I'm here on behalf of U.S. Taiwan Watch. We are currently in Project 2049 Institute, and I have the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Ian Easton, distinguished author of two books, his latest, which is The Final Struggle Inside China's Global Strategy. Mr. Easton, thank you very much for your time.
John, thanks for coming.
Which is a very important point about Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan parallels. Could you go briefly into what the U.S. policy is regarding Taiwan, strategic ambiguity potentially?
The United States government has a very troubled policy when it comes to Taiwan. It's troubled because Taiwan exists as a free, independent, sovereign, democratic country, but it is not treated as such by the United States. And in fact, we've not had diplomatic relations with Taiwan since 1979. Prior to 1979, Taiwan was a treaty ally. We had tens of thousands of troops stationed in Taiwan. We had a mutual defense treaty, actually had nuclear weapons deployed to Taiwan to defend Taiwan against the possibility of a Chinese Communist Party invasion in the 1950s, but all the way through to the 1970s. But unfortunately, the PRC has this zero-sum policy. It's a zero-sum game that they play. That governments can either recognize Beijing as the one true China, or they can recognize Taiwan, the Republic of China, ROC, as the one true China. And so over time, most governments now recognize the PRC, and that requires them to actively deny that Taiwan is a country. And so that's where we are today. Fortunately, we still have the Taiwan Relations Act, and we have President Reagan's 6 assurances to Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act has two key provisions in it. Both are security related. One is that the United States government, as a matter of policy, will maintain the capacity to respond to any use of force or coercion against Taiwan. So not just an invasion, but also a potential blockade or even extreme forms of economic warfare. That the U.S. government, as a matter of policy, as a matter of law, in fact, because this is U.S. law, domestic law, that we and our military has to maintain the ability to defend Taiwan. Doesn't guarantee that we will.
You anticipated my question, Mr. Easton.
And this is where strategic ambiguity comes in. But the second provision of the Taiwan Relations Act, we will provide Taiwan with defensive arms and services. In other words, arms sales. That will provide Taiwan with the weapons that the Taiwanese military needs to maintain a credible self-defense.
And in your opinion, do you believe that the history of arms sales and the current crop of arms sales would provide a credible deterrent or defensive capability to Taiwan in the event of Chinese aggression?
No, I do not.
If we may return to the strategic ambiguity, it seems as if you are in support of strategic clarity or a clarification of what the U.S. policy would be in terms of defense. Would that be?
Well, I think any policy that is based on a myth is going to get us into trouble. Right now, our policy towards the People's Republic of China and our policy towards Taiwan is based on myth. It's the myth that there's only one China in the world and that there's not two separate countries, two separate governments, when in fact it's obvious there are two countries in the world that have China in their name. There's the People's Republic of China and there's the Republic of China. One of those countries is a communist one-party dictatorship, very, very deeply authoritarian, in fact to the point where it's totalitarian. It's like something out of an Orwellian nightmare. The other is a thriving democracy that in fact is ranked among the world's top 10 leading democracies. And it's America's, this year, I believe, it's our 8th largest trading partner, in addition to all that. And it's a key node in the telecommunications ecosystem. And so it's ironic when you think about it, that every day we extend legitimacy to our strategic rival, to this dictatorship in Beijing, and we actively deny legitimacy to Taiwan's Republic of China's government. That we treat China like it's not a legitimate country, when of course it is. And so I think strategic clarity begins with the facts. It's counterproductive, in my opinion, for the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government to deny that Taiwan does exist as a country. I think that's very counterproductive. That makes all of the military and defense and security issues so much more difficult, because every time the Pentagon comes to the National Security Council or the White House and says, we need to do X, Y, or Z to fulfill our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act, in order for our war plans or defense of Taiwan plans to work, we need to be able to do X, Y, or Z. And time again, they're told, no, you cannot do that because that will go against our one China policy. And so you can see how this would get us into some trouble. Taiwan, the idea of strategic ambiguity is we're not going to commit to the defense of Taiwan. The U.S. government, as a matter of policy, will not commit. We've committed to the defense of Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, and of course all of our NATO allies. There's about 50 countries around the world that have an ironclad security commitment from the United States. And along with that commitment, because it's not just a piece of paper, comes a lot of real world tangible exercises that go on, military deployments that go on, a whole range of activities go on between our government and the governments of our allies, our treaty allies. Those are not going on today with Taiwan. Taiwan is isolated, and that is very, very destabilizing. Strategic ambiguity, the idea that we don't know if we'll defend Taiwan, but we might. And recently we've heard President Biden say we will intervene on Taiwan's behalf militarily. And he said it 3 times now. You know, for all we know, by the time this interview is over, he'll have said it a 4th or a 5th time, right? But each time he says that, then his staff will walk it back. And so we're still in this ambiguous position where we don't know. And because we don't know if we'll defend Taiwan or not, and by we, I mean the United States of America, because we don't know, that makes planning very difficult. That makes being prepared for it very difficult. And it greatly increases the risk that in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, there will be very devastating and tragic friendly fire on both sides because our militaries are not coordinating with each other. They don't train together. They don't know each other at all. And in fact, President Biden has now had 5 very long telephone conversations or digital summits with Chairman Xi Jinping in Beijing. He has not once called President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan. Not once. Not a phone call. Not an email. Not a text message. So that means that our leaders are not talking to each other. That greatly increases the risk of miscalculation.
Some on the other side, though, Mr. Easton, would say that switching to strategic clarity also carries some risks, specifically that it would reduce Taiwanese efforts to improve their own defensive capabilities. Some of the allies, perchance those that are closer to China, would not support the change to strategic clarity, resulting in the loss of some allies. Also, that it may confirm in Beijing's mind that the U.S. is actively seeking U.S. independence. How do you reply to those points?
I think from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, Taiwan does not exist. Taiwan doesn't have an independent government. But of course, the reality is that Taiwan does exist. The Republic of China government does exist. Taiwan does enjoy popular sovereignty. It exists. It's a real country. I've been there. I know. I've lived in China. I've lived in Taiwan. These are separate countries. And so the idea that by improving our diplomatic relations with Taiwan, that would somehow be inherently provocative to Beijing, that says much more about the troubled nature of the Chinese Communist Party's own legitimacy, or perhaps its lack of legitimacy, because the Chinese people don't get a vote. This is a one-party dictatorship. And so I think from the United States perspective, from this American's perspective, we should not be basing our foreign policy on the insecurities of our strategic rival. Mm-hmm. We should be basing our foreign policy on what is in our own national security interest, both our pragmatic interests and our principled interests as a believer in freedom and democracy. Regarding what those interests are and where they align with Taiwan, I think we have a great interest in supporting liberal democracies, like-minded countries like Taiwan. I do believe we are in a war of ideas with the Chinese Communist Party. I think strategic competition between the U.S. and the PRC is not just about who has more ships in their navy or who has more missiles. It's about a lot more than that. And it's not just about tariffs and economic warfare and trade disputes either. At the end of the day, this is about what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where individuals are empowered to decide for themselves what their future will look like, where people and countries can be represented and have a voice? Or Do we want to live in a world where people don't have a voice and individuals don't matter? Individuals just become an instrument for the glory of the state.
And let me go ahead and interrupt you, Mr. Easton. So you had said there's some strategic differences between the United States and the PRC, the CCP. In your book, there is a wonderful chart about what you believe are the strategic pros and cons of each system. Could you go ahead and go into some detail regarding what you believe may be the strategic strengths of the United States, as well as that of the PRC, and how we could counter those strategic strengths of the PRC?
Yeah, so a big part of the book is looking at strategic competition between the US and the PRC. And part of that involves, how do we judge the state of play? What are the metrics that we use? How do we measure who's winning and who's losing, and who might be winning 5 years from now or 10 years into the future? How do you judge that? I mean, these are big, unstructured, very squishy analytical problems. And so if you start with first principles, the United States has a great advantage because we have a much higher standard of living. We have a humanistic ideology, and the United States does have an ideology. I mean, read our Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. We're a very experimental kind of country. Before the United States came along, the entire history of humanity was a history of strongman rule that manifested itself in the form of emperors and kings, queens, and tyrants and dictators of all stripes, right? But ultimately it came down to people were instruments to be used by their governments or their regimes or their empires, right? The United States is very different. Since 1776, we have tried this experiment in empowering individuals legally. And so individuals don't have to do what the government tells them to do. And in fact, the whole purpose of the government is to serve the people and to provide for their security and for their well-being and to ensure that they have all of their basic freedoms, and that protects their human rights. So I think that's a great advantage that the United States has, is the quality of life, the quality of the ideology, the fact that we have rule of law on our side, and of course that we do still have a more powerful military and economy, and we have an edge when it comes to education and technology. So these are all areas where the United States still maintains significant strategic advantages. But I think the warning message that I try to issue in this book is we are now on a trajectory where the PRC is catching up. And in some areas, they've already surpassed us. And if we continue on the road that we're on currently, we could go into a very dark future.